Hi, so I'm Sophie. Unlike Alex, I'm not used to speaking at conferences like this. This is the first time I've done a conference. I've kind of done talks at work and a couple of lightning talks at meetups in York. One which went really well, one which went horribly wrong, where I forgot everything I was going to say. So I'm hoping that this goes a bit better, but be patient with me. So I work at Pixel in York as a kind of DevOps coach. I started that role back in July. I have this splendidly silly job title of DevOps Transformation Lead, which is, let's not go there. But before that, I'd spent 20 years working as a software developer. So I think IT and software delivery has changed a lot in that time. But I think DevOps is by far the biggest change that I've seen. So I'm going to tell you a bit about my own kind of DevOps journey. But first, what I mean by DevOps, because it's one of those things that means different things to different people. I think it's about better business. It's about delivering value to customers more quickly, more frequently, more reliably, less risk. But I also think it's about people. It's about us. It's about the people who work in IT and software delivery. It's about making IT a more just and a more humane place to work. And it's about making our working lives better. So a large part of DevOps is undoubtedly the technology, that kind of stuff that Alex was talking about. But it's also about the way we work and how we work together to produce and support software. So I am going to talk about my experience of how DevOps has developed, kind of from the people side of things, and give a few examples from along the way. Some from what now feel like a very long time ago, to some more recent. So this is my one I'm talking about me slide. I might do a quiz at the end and see if people can see where each image is fitted into my story. So I graduated in 1995 from the University of Central Lancashire in Preston with a degree in business computing. And I moved to Cambridge because I'd landed myself a job with one of the big software houses, courtesy of their graduate recruitment scheme. And I stayed there for about a year before I then moved on to another company in Cambridge called Chadwick Keeley, who they'd started life as a publishing house, but then they'd moved into software and they specialised in kind of large online academic reference applications, which they sold to universities and libraries. So a couple of the projects that I worked on while I was there were the entire works of Goethe and 20 versions of the Bible in English, from the King James Bible of 1611 to the Good News Bible of 1976. So Chadwick Keeley was quite siloed. It had separate departments for editorial, for software development, which is obviously where I lived, and for data processing. So the people in data processing were responsible for the large, complex amounts of SGML data that these applications needed. They took the text of the published work and they transformed it to add all the tags and make the structure so it could be indexed and made searchable and retrievable. And they had an application to help them with this. It was basic text processing, really. They could search for text and search for tags and embed new tags. And it was written in C, and it had been written by a contractor who was no longer there. And it worked, but it was really slow. And at one point, there was a guy called Gowan, and he was spending time each day splitting up one of these large files of HTML into chunks. And at the end of each day, he was commandeering his colleagues' desktops, copying a chunk of this file, one onto each PC, and then manually setting off the C program to run overnight so he could run it in parallel and speed things up. And then he would come in early the next morning before anyone else had arrived, and he'd gather these chunks of HTML back together and he'd stitch them into a single file and he'd keep going with his work. And this seemed absolutely crazy to me because it was really inefficient at getting the work done. It was only being run once every 24 hours. It was really error prone because Gowan was setting the process off manually, so only had to put in the parameters on one box wrong and potentially waste the whole night's processing. Only had to take for one of the processes to fall over on one of the boxes overnight, again for the whole night to be wasted. And apart from anything else, it was miserable for Gowan. He was, doing this menial, boring task. He was staying late every night. He was coming in early every morning. Just awful. So I turned freelancer. And at that time, I'd recently been learning Perl. So Perl is great for text processing. It has really good support for regular expressions. And I wrote Gowan a little script which basically did the same job as the C program, but it ran in tens of seconds on the whole file. And poor Gowan, he was so grateful when I gave him this. So very commendable, I hear you say, but what's it got to do with DevOps? Well, actually quite a lot. Because it's all about breaking down silos and collaboration, working together, seeing this as a kind of our problem rather than Gowan's problem. It's about working together to deliver value more quickly. So we, said it ran in tens of seconds, so we could, and it more reliably, because it wasn't being, there was none of that thing of splitting up the file and then having to stitch it back together and making our working lives better. So Gowan no longer had to stay late, come in early, and we'd effectively automated away the boring, menial, repetitive tasks. So this freed Gowan up to do work that was more valuable for the company and more interesting for Gowan. So very much DevOps. So in 1998, I moved to York, and about a year later, I started work at what's now called Pixel. So yes, I have been there for nearly 19 years. So Pixel do both software development and managed services, so they look after other companies' operations and platforms. Sometimes we do both of these for one customer, sometimes it's just one or the other. So I was at that time working in a cross-functional team, both ops and devs, and we were dedicated to a single client whose business model basically consisted of buying raw prescription data from pharmacies. So when you go to your doctor and they give you a prescription, when you go to the pharmacy and they give you drugs, the data from that transaction is stored in the pharmacy's system, so data about the doctor, about the drugs that are prescribed, about you. So they would buy this raw data and then they would process it to anonymize it, as they were legally obliged to do, and then they'd stick it in a couple of big databases, and then they used that to sell business intelligence back to pharmaceutical companies. So we wrote and supported an interesting collection of applications on an interesting collection of kind of infrastructure, and an interesting collection of languages and frameworks. It was, yeah. We basically ran an ISP service for the pharmacies, including remotely configuring and managing thousands of routers on site, so what would now be called software-defined networking, although we didn't at the time know it had such a cool name. There was another large system for distributed system for gathering and encrypting the data and securely transferring it to other sites to be processed. So it was often a bit mental, but it was never dull. So like I said, we were a cross-functional team, but we were slightly siloed within that. There were 4 ops guys, 4 Unix engineers, one of whom was TL for them. There was 4 devs, one of whom was TL. I forgot to mention Dave. Dave was client director, overseeing everybody. We had DBAs in what Dan North termed a shallow silo, so they weren't actually in our team, but they were just there when we needed them. And after I'd been there for about a year, we hired Pixel's very first QA engineer. So I eventually went on to become TL for the devs. At one point, 3 of the 4 of us were women, and I also worked part-time, so we were slightly unusual from that perspective too, as well as being cross-functional. We were a bit more diverse. So this is a kind of more obviously DevOps setup in that we were cross-functional, we were collaborative, we were kind of a long-lived full-service ownership, much closer to what will now be called a product team rather than a project team. We were doing things and then supporting them long-term with our customers, and we were a bit more diverse. We were also what I kind of call greater than the sum of our parts. There's no way we could have produced and supported the software we did without having the devs, ops and QA all working together in the way we did from the very start of a project all the way through to it being in production and being supported. And we were also kind of quite self-organized and quite a lot of trust from our client. They would quite often just present us with a problem to solve and trust that we would come back with a workable solution that met their needs. Uniquely for Pixel at that time, we were co-located. The office at Pixel has 3 floors. The first floor is kind of like meeting rooms and things like HR. The first floor always used to be just devs, and the top floor was just ops. It's a bit more mixed up now, but it was like that for a long time. But my team all sat together on the top floor, and we pretty much took this for granted until one of those kind of periodic office reshuffles where some manager somewhere decided that we devs should go sit downstairs with the rest of our kind. And the whole team kind of begged for this not to happen. The ops, the devs, Dave went and pleaded our case, but no, down we went. And that lasted for about 3 months until the project manager at our customer basically stamped her feet and demanded that we be reunited because of the visible impact that it was having on the service that we were providing. Because I'm not saying that co-location is the only way for this to work and that distributed teams can't work, but we were used to working in this way of just hearing each other's conversations and shouting questions out loud and having to walk no more than about 6 feet if you wanted a quiet conversation at someone's desk. So to suddenly have a whole flight of stairs to negotiate, it just proved too much. I'm not saying we didn't still talk, we did, but we had to have a reason to actually go and talk, and it took longer because if you had a problem, you'd try and fix it. If you were an ops guy, you'd ask the ops. If you were dev, eventually you'd go up or down the stairs. And if you were lucky, you'd find the person you needed to talk to straight away. If you're not, they might have gone to the loo, they might have made a cup of tea, so you go back down, you'd have to try again, so it took longer. So it's not how you have those conversations that matter, it's having those conversations, that kind of daily awareness and being in the same team. The other thing that was really important, I think, is that we had buy-in to this way of working from our client. I think that was quite key to our success. I have seen much later at Pixel another team try and take on more DevOps ways of working, so continuous delivery and devs on call. But they didn't really have the support of either their biggest customer or the service delivery managers at Pixel. So it was fine while everything was going okay. They were kind of allowed to continue with their grand experiment. And as soon as they hit some problems, it was like, well, we told you this was never going to work. We're going to go back to having weekly CAB meetings and a dedicated managed service team. So the fact that our customer was on board with this way of working, I think, was critical. It wasn't all shiny DevOps perfection, no. We didn't have any automated pipelines like Alex was telling us about. We had a Jenkins server for continuous integration, and that was it. So it ran unit tests when we committed code changes. But after that, all builds were manual, and they had to be done for the right environment. And we had some horrible deployments where we were trying to release kind of months and months of dev work, as well as doing infrastructure changes with no viable rollback plan. And as soon as things start going wrong, which they do, because they always do, there's no choice but to kind of keep moving forward and try and fix things on live boxes. You've got people jumping on and changing stuff, and you finally get to the point where it's working, but everyone's just terrified of ever touching it again. I mean, as a dev, I used to say, don't have code you're afraid of. Don't have code that's got no unit tests and too complex that you don't want to touch it. But the same goes for infrastructure. Don't have boxes that you are too scared to touch because no one quite understands how they work. We had one deployment where it basically took us a week. We started on Thursday morning and it went very quickly started going wrong. And we worked all day Thursday, all Thursday night till about 1 a.m, back in the office Friday morning at 8, all Friday, all weekend. And by about Wednesday, we'd finally got it to a point where we could kind of say, we're okay, we can now fix the remaining problems, and more leisurely kind of, go look at them and just grim. This way of working is no good for anybody. It's no good for the business. It's no good for customers. It's certainly no good for the people who are doing this kind of grueling toil. And that's where the pipelines come in, because if we'd had proper pipelines, we could have small batches, we could have done little pieces of work, released it frequently in business hours, better for us, better for the customer, because they'd be getting little bits at a time. So anyway, nor did we have devs on call, which at the time we didn't question it. It was just kind of how the world worked. Devs didn't do on call, that's what ops did. So even though we were one team, we still didn't do on call. Although in my defense, I probably spent about 10 years on unofficial escalation for app support. But looking back now, I think it was kind of a bit weird and a bit wrong. I think we would have been a better team had we had devs on call, and we probably would have made us better devs, because we did think about the operability side and the logging, but it would have made us even better had we be the ones dealing with it at 3 a.m. So anyway, by 2010, I was ready for a change. And when the opportunity came up to work on some internal projects, I jumped at it. So this was writing and supporting applications to support the managed service teams at Pixel. So things like managing on-call rotas, sending SMS alerts to on-call engineers, automating the creation of tickets. I kind of jokingly started calling myself the ops dev at this point, but only about 2 people ever got the joke, so I quickly dropped it. So it's around this time that what we think of as the DevOps movement really started to kind of take off and gain some traction. The first DevOps Days conference was held in Belgium. John Allspaw and Paul Hammond gave their seminal talk at the Velocity conference, about 10 plus deploys per day, Dev and Ops cooperation at Flickr. Well worth a watch, you can find it on YouTube. And in 2011, Jez Humble and Dave Farley published the Continuous Delivery book. So in the teams that I was working with at this time, kind of directly and indirectly, I saw a real interest in and adoption of the tech and the tooling of what we think of as DevOps. There was a massive surge in the use of Puppet for configuration management and infrastructure, automated pipelines for some for infrastructure as well as for applications, moving things into the cloud, kind of AWS mostly to start with, but Azure is catching up. There's serverless, there's shiny Grafana dashboards for metrics, engineers with DevOps in their job title. But a lot of this, to me, started to feel like we were kind of missing the point a bit of DevOps. It didn't say, it's a bit harsh to say it was tech for tech's sake, but that was a bit how it felt. It's like, we are techies, we get the tech, we like the tech, we'll do that side of it, without kind of really thinking about it from the business side or from the people side of things. So I was seeing teams that were overworked with no slack time for learning and development, even time just to reflect on how things might be done better or to start thinking about how to address technical debt. Too much work in progress. So all the problems that are involved with that, with like context switching and everything takes longer. Trying to complete tasks for a number of different people at who've asked for work to be done, so and with conflicting priorities. So quite often it was the person who had shouted the loudest most recently whose work would get looked at, or the HIPPO principle, which is the highest paid person's opinion. We see a lot of that one as well. I saw teams, lack of trust and no self-organisation, so teams not just being given an objective and then being trusted to best decide how to achieve it, and being allowed to get on with it, but constantly having more work pushed at them and then conflicting priorities and just miserable. And no culture of improvement, so no sharing of the new tech skills that are being learnt, teams kind of picking up skills in isolation and not sharing them and improving. So this was kind of a bit ironic for me because it was at this time that I started to get more and more interested in the other side of DevOps, the people side. I read the Phoenix Project for the first time. I started reading about theory of constraints and value stream mapping and blameless postmortems and pre-mortems and Kanban and flow. I persuaded my manager to let me go to the Pipeline Conference, which is a really good one-day conference in London about continuous delivery, and also to the DevOps Enterprise Summit. I started going to some meetups, Leeds DevOps sometimes, Agile York, and I finally got myself onto Twitter, which I'd always resisted because I always thought it was just kind of celebs shamelessly self-promoting. And instead I found this awesome community of clever people, sharing their amazing body of knowledge about DevOps and testing and Kanban and Agile and everything. So after about 2 years of this kind of me absorbing all this knowledge and watching how badly some of the stuff was going at Pixel, not the tech side, but the other side of things, I finally kind of flipped and I basically yelled at my manager. So this is the nice one. Remember the one who got DevOps, who let me go to conferences? And to my surprise, he not only took this quite well, but he actually agreed with me. And this is when I changed my role after this kind of initial. We had some more conversations like that, and then I changed my role. So now I spend much of my time working with teams at Pixel, trying to help us do DevOps better. So I've started working with a number of teams, including HR, which is interesting. They're kind of quite on board with learning Kanban and things. So yeah, we're starting with Kanban so we can visualize our work, visualize our workflow. There's a kind of, I don't know, call it tradition at Pixel where in the managed service teams, which is mostly who I'm working with, they use Jira for project work and they use BMC Remedy for kind of business as usual tickets. So the problem with this is there's no one place to see all the work a team is working on, and those systems just aren't visual. You have to log in to actually see them. So at the minute we're trying out some seriously low-tech solutions, and we have post-it notes on whiteboards, so that's quite new. And then the next thing is to start looking at setting some WIP limits, which is already starting to force the conversation kind of upstream to the people who give work to these teams. So it's kind of having a ripple effect. So it's going to get interesting, I think. So that's about better prioritization, because that's one of the big problems. And breaking work into smaller batches. We have, if you look at the Kanban boards at the minute, there's a lot of just kind of like big projects that just sat there in progress. And it's almost like mini waterfall. So it doesn't really help. You need to get them smaller, and then you can get things moving across. And so I've set up and run a community of practice, DevOps community of practice. We meet every couple of weeks. We just kind of do lean coffee type discussions, but we've also run sessions of Feature Ban, which is a Kanban simulation game. We have what we grandly call DevOps cinema. So we've watched video for a recording of a talk from a conference, and then we have a discussion about it afterwards. Got plans for more workshops. I plan to steal Alex's idea for the Gods and Reporters workshop that she did. That'd be good. And I really like to get some external speakers, so if anyone wants to come and talk testing to us, come find me, because that would be good. And I've also been running for nearly a year now lightning talks, which we have every week. We call them lightning talks, but they can be anything from like 10 minutes to half an hour. It's up to the speaker. And some are really techie focused, others not so, but it's a really good way of getting people together every week. Share their stories, share their learning, slightly more social. We have kind of breakfasty things, but to try and get that culture of sharing and learning, and this idea of turning your individual and team learning into organizational learning. So what's next? So kind of what's next for me, what's next for DevOps? I've given this a lot of thought over recent weeks about what I should say at this point. Should I talk about ownership and leadership? Should I talk about transparency and clarity, or the need for visualization of work at all levels? But the more I thought about it, the more I thought what we actually need is simply better communication. Because I often find myself being asked, so what is DevOps? Or talking to people who think it's just about the tech. And trying to get across the idea that it's all this stuff together. It's the pipelines and the automation and the cloud, but very much also about how we work. And yeah, just the cultural side of things I think is really lacking. I was lucky enough to go to kind of two of the big DevOps conferences this year. I went to the DevOps Enterprise Summit and I went to DevOps Days. And each time I went with someone who admittedly would admit themselves they didn't know that much about DevOps before they went. And they both came away just kind of completely enthused, but also blown away by what they'd learned, but also surprised that it was not, most of the talks weren't technical. They were talking about empathy and about the business needs for DevOps and how it makes your company succeed and how we all need to work together better. So they were like, they'd gone thinking it was just going to be really kind of dry technical talks, and they weren't. So, but I can't take everybody to a conference. So if we just need, I don't know whether we need a new name, because it's not very inclusive. It doesn't include testers or business analysts or. So I find myself trying to explain what DevOps means, and yeah, just more of this, I guess, just more people talking about it. And I shudder to use the word evangelize, but yeah, maybe kind of just evangelizing about what DevOps is and what it brings for us, and yeah, that it's about better for business and better for people, which is like I started with. So that's me done, I think.
got a couple of minutes for questions. Brilliant talk, thank you. We've got a couple of minutes for questions, and then we'll have a break, and then we'll return for workshops. So, has anybody got any questions?
Nope.
Just one. Yeah, you mentioned some of the talks. Are these public talks that you do then? Are there any in Sheffield or any nearby?
Any what, sorry?
Do you host any sort of talks?
No, they're all internal, the ones we do.
All internal?
There are, I mean, there's some good meetups. The Leeds DevOps ones is really good. I think that's starting up again soon. I'm a bit of a wuss about coming to Leeds in the evening, I must admit. Agile York, if you're around in York, Agile York is really good. And Women in Tech, which is open to everybody, is brilliant. That's quite relatively new, but it's turning into like a really good community in York. But I know there's loads of meetups in Leeds.
And there's some in Sheffield as well. There's a testimony in Sheffield.
Yeah, there's a Women in Tech in Sheffield as well. So.
And DevOps Sheffield.
There's a, yeah, okay. So, here.
One thing I find that people, when you sort of talk to them about DevOps, they quite intuitively get quite a lot of it, how that would be better. The thing that I think people struggle to understand is WIP limits, limiting work in progress.
Very counterintuitive.
Yeah, exactly.
It really is.
Have you got any tricks that you've used to sort of explain that to people?
I found playing Feature Ban, which is Mike Burrows and Gender Shift, and I've had people come along to it and who'd been kind of persuaded to come and were coming along fully admitting they were being completely cynical and sceptical and this wasn't going to teach them anything and just being completely turned around in the space of about 40 minutes from playing this very simple kind of game where you flip a coin to see if you're going to block work or move work. And then the second round you set WIP limits and all of a sudden you start to get work flowing. And that's really, really quite something watching that.
Powerful, you can illustrate.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
And it's all completely free as well, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, and it's really.
You can just download and print off.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
And there's facilitators because I'd never done it before, and I was like, right, okay, how am I going? And it just worked really well. So, yeah, that was quite, illuminating.
I started to write down Feature Ban earlier. You said something else interesting.
Right. So, yeah, I think that was the biggest thing for WIP limits. But you're right, it is counterintuitive. There's the idea of doing less, you do more.
Maybe one final question?
Nope.
No?
Nope.
Okay, big round of applause again.